A man who once ruled over Europe, reduced to pacing alone on a forgotten island, surrounded by silence, wind, and regret. Here at Stoic Lighthouse, we don't chase quick fixes or empty promises. We look for clarity, direction, and inner stillness in a world that constantly pulls us off course. How does someone rise so high, only to collapse so completely? Was Napoleon Bonaparte a victim of fate or the architect of his own downfall? Today, we put him on trial, not just as a general, not just as an emperor, but as a mind under pressure. We'll examine the discipline that made him unstoppable and the ego that made him blind. Because in the end, this is not just about Napoleon. It's about what happens when ambition grows faster than wisdom. Number 1, relentless focus, discipline beyond comfort. Napoleon didn't rise by chance. He built himself through pressure most people would never tolerate. His routine bordered on obsession. He slept little, worked constantly, made decisions at a pace that overwhelmed even his closest advisors. While others hesitated, he moved. While others rested, he calculated. He could dictate multiple letters at once, switching between military strategy, political decisions, and logistics without losing clarity. It wasn't just intelligence, it was control over attention. And that's where the Stoics would immediately recognize something familiar. Marcus Aurelios reflected, "Concentrate every minute like a Roman, like a man on doing what's in front of you with precise and genuine seriousness." Napoleon lived this principle, even if unconsciously. He treated time as a battlefield. Every minute had a purpose. Every action moved something forward. There was no room for distraction, no patience for comfort. Modern philosopher William B Irvine often emphasizes that the quality of our lives depends on where we place our attention. Napoleon mastered this at an extreme level. He didn't allow the world to scatter his focus. He forced reality to align with it. But here's the tension. Discipline, by itself, is neutral. The same force that builds empires can also destroy the person behind them. At this point, Napoleon appears almost stoic, focused, unshakable, fully engaged with the present. But the question hasn't been answered yet. Was he in control of his discipline? Or was his discipline quietly controlling him? Number 2, engineering order, the mind behind the Napoleonic Code. Napoleon wasn't just a man of war, he was a man obsessed with order. After the chaos of the French Revolution, France wasn't just unstable, it was fractured. Laws contradicted each other, privileges still lingered. Justice depended more on geography than on principle. Napoleon saw this not as a political inconvenience, but as a structural failure, and he moved to fix it. The Napoleonic Code was his attempt to impose clarity on confusion. A unified legal system, predictable, rational, structured around the idea that law should not be inherited through bloodlines, but applied equally through logic. It eliminated feudal privileges, reinforced merit over birth, established a framework where, at least in theory, a man's position would be defined by ability, not ancestry. This is where his mind aligns most closely with Stoic philosophy. The Stoics believed in logos, a rational order that governs the universe. And the role of the wise person is to align human systems with that order. Seneca argued, "The true ruler is one who acts not out of anger, but guided by reason and a commitment to fairness." In this sense, Napoleon wasn't just conquering territory. He was trying to organize reality, to replace chaos with structure, emotion with calculation, tradition with logic. And for a moment, it worked. If this way of seeing life resonates with you, it's because you're not just looking for answers on the surface. You're trying to understand how to live with clarity. This channel exists for exactly that reason. But even here, something subtle begins to shift. Because the desire to impose order on the world can slowly become the belief that you are the source of that order. And that's where things start to break. Number 3, bending reality, action in the face of chaos. Napoleon didn't believe in waiting for the right conditions. He believed in creating them. While most people freeze when faced with uncertainty, he moved toward it, fast, decisive, unapologetic. There's a reason his enemies often felt like they were always one step behind. It wasn't luck, it was his refusal to accept reality as fixed. A phrase often attributed to him captures this mindset perfectly. Impossible is a word to be found only in the dictionary of fools. Arrogant? Maybe, but also revealing, because at its core, this reflects a radical interpretation of one of the most powerful Stoic principles, the dichotomy of control. Epictetus taught, "Do not seek for events to happen as you wish, but wish for events to happen as they do happen, and your life will go smoothly." Napoleon flipped this idea on its head. He didn't adapt to events, he forced events to adapt to him. At the Battle of Austerlitz, outnumbered and facing a coalition of armies, he didn't retreat. He manipulated perception itself. He appeared weak, baited his enemies into overextending, and then struck with precision. It was calculated, intentional, almost surgical. He took what was given to him and reshaped it through sheer force of will. And this is where things become dangerously compelling, because this mindset feels powerful. It feels like total control, like mastery over chaos. But there's a hidden cost. When you start believing you can control everything, you stop recognizing the limits of what you actually control, and that's the exact moment where strength begins to turn into fragility. Number 4, the crown and the ego. When power corrupts the mind. There's a moment that defines the shift. Not on a battlefield, not in a strategy room, but inside a cathedral. December 2nd, 1804, Notre Dame, Paris. Napoleon stands before the Pope, ready to be crowned emperor. The ceremony is meant to symbolize divine approval, a transfer of legitimacy from God to man. But then, something unexpected happens. He takes the crown out of the Pope's hands and places it on his own head. That single gesture says everything. It wasn't just political theater, it was a declaration. He no longer saw himself as part of an order. He saw himself as the source of it. This is where discipline stops being a virtue and becomes fuel for something else entirely. For the Stoics, this moment marks the beginning of collapse, because the greatest threat to wisdom is not ignorance, it's arrogance. Marcus Aurelios warned himself constantly, "Be careful that you do not become a Caesar, that you are not dyed with the purple." Power, in the Stoic view, is a test, not of strength but of restraint, and Napoleon failed that test. He began to believe he was untouchable, that his judgment was superior not just to others, but to reality itself. The same mind that once operated with clarity started to distort, because when you place yourself above everything, you lose the ability to see anything clearly. And from that point forward, every decision stops being about what is right and starts being about proving that you are. Number 5, the road to collapse, when ambition loses control. Ambition can build empires, but without limits, it consumes them. By 1812, Napoleon had already reshaped Europe. His influence was unmatched, his power seemingly unquestionable. And that's exactly when he made his most catastrophic decision. Russia, not out of necessity, not out of strategy, but out of refusal. Refusal to accept limits, refusal to tolerate defiance, refusal to not expand. He assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen, hundreds of thousands of men marching into a land that would not fight on his terms. The Russians didn't confront him directly, they retreated. Step by step, they pulled him deeper into their territory, burning cities, destroying resources, leaving nothing behind, including Moscow. And still, he pushed forward, not because it made sense, but because turning back would mean admitting he was wrong. Seneca warned about this kind of blindness. No man is more unhappy than he who never faces adversity, for he is not permitted to prove himself. Napoleon had faced adversity before, but now he was failing a different test. The test of restraint. The cold arrived, then hunger, then collapse. The Grande Armée, once the most powerful military force in the world, disintegrated not in battle, but in silence. Frozen roads, starvation, desperation. What began as a campaign of dominance ended as a retreat of survival. And the most dangerous part, this wasn't a failure of intelligence, it was a failure of self-control. The Stoics believed that true power is not measured by how far you can go, but by knowing when to stop. Napoleon never learned that, and because of it, everything he built began to unravel. Number 6. Exile and Emptiness. The man without an inner empire. In the end, Napoleon didn't fall on a battlefield. He faded. Exiled to St. Helena, a remote island in the Atlantic, he was stripped of everything that once defined him. No armies, no court, no power, just silence and himself. This is where the Stoic test becomes unavoidable, because it's easy to appear strong when the world bends in your favor. But what remains when everything is taken away? Musonius Rufus taught, exile does not deprive a man of what is truly his. It only removes what never belonged to him. Napoleon had lost the external empire. Now he was forced to confront whether he had ever built an internal one. The answer becomes painfully clear. Instead of peace, there was bitterness. Instead of acceptance, resentment. He argued with his captors over titles and status, clung to symbols of power that no longer existed, rewrote his story in an attempt to preserve an image that reality had already dismantled. He couldn't let go, and that reveals everything. Because the Stoics didn't teach detachment as indifference. They taught it as freedom. Freedom from needing the world to validate you. Modern philosopher Alain de Botton observed, if your sense of who you are depends entirely on how others see you, then you are at the mercy of forces you cannot control. That was Napoleon's final prison, not the island, but his own identity. He had spent his life conquering the external world, but never learned how to govern himself, and when everything else disappeared, there was nothing left to hold on to. Number 7. Final verdict. The modern Icarus. The Stoic court has heard both sides. On one hand, a man of extraordinary discipline, a mind capable of shaping nations, bending circumstances, and executing decisions with unmatched precision. On the other, a man consumed by his own elevation, blinded by success, incapable of restraint, unable to exist without power. So what is the final judgment? Was Napoleon Bonaparte a Stoic? No, not even close. He possessed the engine of Stoicism, but not its direction. He had discipline, but no humility. Action, but no restraint. Vision, but no inner balance. The Stoics never admired power for its own sake. They admired control over the self. And that is where Napoleon failed completely. His life mirrors the myth of Icarus. He built wings powerful enough to rise above everyone else, wings forged from intelligence, will, and relentless discipline. And for a moment, he flew higher than anyone in history, but he mistook elevation for invincibility, ignored limits, rejected moderation, and flew too close to the sun. The higher he rose, the less he could see, until the fall became inevitable, not because he lacked strength, but because he lacked control over that strength. Napoleon didn't lose his empire in Russia. He lost it the moment he stopped governing himself. Napoleon's story endures because it reflects something uncomfortable. The same traits that elevate a person can also destroy them. Discipline, ambition, focus. These are not virtues by themselves. They are tools. And in the wrong hands, even the strongest tools become weapons turned inward. The Stoics never warned us against success. They warned us against losing ourselves in the process of chasing it. Because in the end, the real question is not how far you can go, but whether you still recognize yourself when you get there. Everything external can be taken from you, but what you build within yourself is the only thing that endures. If this reflection stayed with you, consider subscribing and continuing this journey with our community. Let Stoic Lighthouse guide you toward calm, clarity, and wisdom. And before you leave, there's something even more dangerous than Napoleon's ambition. What happens when people misunderstand Stoicism itself and start using it to suppress emotions instead of mastering them? That's exactly what we're breaking down next. Remember, the greatest empire you will ever rule is the one within your own mind. Until the next video.